Welcome everybody. Hope you're enjoying this weather. Maybe it's winter's last stand, I'm not sure. Most of you know me. My name is Brent. I'm one of the teachers here at Mac on Wednesday night. I'm usually the one who teaches on apologetics, on worldview type issues. I like to take different worldviews and talk about them, how they differ with Christianity, how they're similar to Christianity, and how Christians should respond to them, and to answer the questions they might have about them. So I've talked about Mormonism before, I've talked about Catholicism before, we've done a lot of stuff on creation versus evolution in the past. Tonight we're going to talk about Islam. This is going to be a 3-week series. Every time I've taught in the past, I've been told that way too much information, way too fast, too much for one night. So I'm splitting this one up into 3 weeks. You might think that's not enough after tonight, because I got a lot to go through tonight. We are talking about the history tonight. I felt that talking about the cool stuff that we're going to talk about next week, the Islamic scriptures and how they view the Bible and how they view Jesus and how they view the gospel, that's the really important stuff, but it's going to make a lot more sense if you understand the historical context where that was developed. So tonight I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about how Islam developed over the years. I'm going to tackle one big question, and the question is Islam peaceful? You've probably heard that question talked about a lot in the media. Every politician will tell you Islam is a religion of peace. But almost every terrorist attack you hear about in the news is done in the name of Islam. So we got this split here within the Islamic community. Those who want peace and those who don't. And they both use the Quran. So we're going to look at the Quran, how the Quran supports both of those positions, and we're going to talk about that conflict tonight. So I always like to start with a couple of Bible verses. Matthew 5:44 I thought would be a good one to start with. It says, this is Jesus speaking, "But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you." I wanted to give Jesus' perspective on enemies because, as you're going to see as we talk about the history of Islam, so many times throughout our history, Muslims and Christians have found themselves as enemies of each other. Enemies on the battlefield oftentimes. And well, there may be some historical reasons for that as we talked about, and there are certainly some huge theological differences. It's unfortunate that we've experienced so much of having them as our enemies. So Christ's perspective on our enemies is to love them, right? So nothing I say tonight or in the weeks to come is aimed at stirring up any kind of hatred or animosity towards those who are as the Islamic faith or who may believe differently than we do. Rather, it's to tell the truth and remind people to love our enemies. And speaking of enemies, there's a verse in Colossians that Paul is speaking to Christians. And he says, "And you who once were alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he is reconciled." And that's really the whole gospel message right there, is that you Christians, we were God's enemies because of our sins, because of our wickedness, because of our rebellion against God. We were God's enemies. What was God's response to his enemies? He went on a rescue mission to save his enemies. That's how much he loved his enemies. So that should be our response to Muslims. We shouldn't look at them as the enemy, but if they choose to make themselves our enemy, we're still called upon to love them because Christ loved us, and that's the gospel message. 1 Peter 3:15 is a verse that almost always shows up in my classes. It's kind of a driving force for what I do with apologetics. It says, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." So Christians are expected to know what we believe, to know why we believe it, and to be able to give a defense. If someone asks you why you're a Christian and not a Muslim, you should be able to give them an answer. Or if they ask you, why do you believe the Bible but you don't believe the Quran? Or why do you believe in Jesus but you don't believe in Muhammad? You should be able to give them an answer, not just, well, this is what my parents taught me, and it kind of works for me, it kind of makes me feel good, so I'm going to go with it. God expects us to be able to defend what we believe. Doesn't mean you're going to be able to win a debate with any scholar from any religion at any given moment, but you're going to be able to have basic answers. So that's part of why I'm doing this tonight, is to give Christians a framework for how to get those answers. A guy named Walter Martin is an apologetics teacher who passed away back in the 1980s. He's somebody I really respect. Back in his day, he was the apologetics teacher when it came to addressing other religions and helping Christians respond to other religions. And this quote is powerful. It says, "You have got to run the risk of being hated by the very people that you're talking to in order that they may be born again." So we got to understand that there's that risk. And Jesus told us we're going to be hated by the world. So we shouldn't be surprised. I understand if I'm up here, I'm talking about Catholicism, I run the risk that some Catholics may hate me, or some Mormons may hate me. I certainly understand that there is a risk that some Muslims may hate us for having this conversation. That's not our intent, but that's a risk that we have to take in order that some people may be born again. The truth is what sets people free, but the truth is also offensive to some people. So keep that in mind as we're having this discussion. Some definitions I want to go over with you, and they're all on your sheet. They're going to make this conversation easier to understand. We're listed here. Islam, what we're talking about tonight, simply means submission. That's what it means in Arabic, submission. Submission is a very important concept in the religion. Muslim, one who practices Islam, is simply one who submits, one who practices submission. Quran is our holy book. We're going to talk more in detail about that next week. It literally means to recite. And reciting is a very important part of Islam as well. Some Muslims can recite the entire Quran. Some Muslims who don't speak Arabic can recite the entire Quran in Arabic. Some as children can. So reciting is a very important part of the religion. Surah, that's simply a chapter in the Quran. You're going to see on my slides when I quote the Quran, it's going to say Surah 1 or Surah 2 or Surah 3. That's how the Quran is organized. It's actually very easy to find your way through the Quran because all there are numbers. It's not like the Bible where if I tell you to go to Jeremiah, you have to think, okay, is that before or after Isaiah? I don't remember. You know, it's not, you don't have to worry about that with the Quran. It's all numbered. Surah 1, Surah 2, Surah 3, real easy. People of the book, that's an Islamic way of referring to Jews and Christians. And you're going to see the word we a lot in the Quran. And that's confusing when you first look at it, but that's how God identifies himself oftentimes in the Quran. Muslims don't believe in the Trinity. They don't believe in the plurality of gods, but they believe that God or Allah is so complete and so full in himself that when they translate into English, it comes across in the plural. So you're going to see, we did this, we did that in the Quran. It just simply means God. Don't let that confuse you too much. So here we go, the history of Islam. I'm going to give just a brief overview. It's going to be kind of fast and furious. I hope you find it interesting. I certainly found it interesting. Remember, Islam came about in the 600s, about 600 years after Christianity. You're also going to see some maps in my presentation. A little circle around the Arabian Peninsula. I'm in the military. I love maps. I can't help it. Just wanted to give you a reference point for where we're talking about. What we call Saudi Arabia today is the Arabian Peninsula. That's where this religion was born. So that's just your reference point. I'll talk a little bit about what was going on in the Arabian Peninsula before Islam started, the lead up, the culture out of which Islam was born. Prior to the 600 ADs, Muslims referred to this time period as a time of ignorance, the time when people just didn't know. Before Allah had revealed himself and established the religion of Islam, it was a time of ignorance. There was no central government in this Arabic Peninsula. That people were tribal and polytheistic. And the best parallel I can come up with is it might have been something like America was before the Europeans came over with the Native Americans. You had all these different tribes. They all kind of had their same view of God. There wasn't necessarily a centralized government. They did practice idolatry. They worshipped as many as 360 different gods. Some of these tribes included Christians and Jews. Remember, this is 600 years after the time of Christ, so Christianity had spread. But for the most part, they were polytheist. During that time, raiding caravans was very common. It was kind of considered an acceptable way for a poorer tribe to make some money, was to raid a caravan. The people were mostly illiterate in the Arabian Peninsula, and as far as we know, there were no Arabic translations of the Bible in the Arabian Peninsula at that time. So if they could read, they probably weren't reading the Bible a whole lot. They were familiar with the Bible because Christians and Jews were there, because missionaries had been going out for the last 600 years, but they probably didn't have, most of them have a Bible in their own language that they could understand. So during this time of ignorance, they had a concept of Allah. He was considered to be the creator God, but he was not elevated above the other gods. He was just one of 360 different gods. Allah was just one of them. Interestingly enough, he had 3 daughters, and you can see their names right there. Now, Muslims today certainly don't believe that Allah has 3 daughters or any sons or any daughters, but you can see the name predates Islam. It was during the time of ignorance. During that time of ignorance, they also practiced what we call Ramadan. That's the 30-day fast that Muslims still practice, based on the lunar calendar, so it falls a little bit different time every year. During those 30 days, it's not like you can't eat at all. You're not supposed to eat, drink, even water, smoke, have sexual relationship, anything like that during the daylight hours. As soon as the sun goes down, you're allowed to participate in that. Now, I was in Iraq during the summer, and I can only imagine not having any water during the entire daylight hours, especially for people who don't have air conditioning. This can be a great sacrifice for Muslims to make. Now, women who are pregnant are not supposed to participate in this fast, but of course, sometimes women may not know they're pregnant, so this can cause some problems. During this time, they made sacrifices in honor of the moon. Now, Muslims today don't make sacrifices in honor of the moon, but you notice a lot of Islamic countries, their flag has a moon on it. So it's still an important part of the religion, but it comes from this time of ignorance. It carried over into Islam. During that time, praying 5 times a day was very common. They had certain prayers that they would pray every single day at certain times, facing a certain direction. This is still practiced by Muslims today. It carried over. And when I was in Iraq, some of my interpreters, one of my really good friends I had over there, they were very devout about this. When it was a certain time, they had to go off and they had to do their prayers. Okay, they had this thing called the Kaaba. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's a big black box. Have you seen that before on TV? The big black box. It's over in a city called Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It was very important long before Islam came around. The best historians can come up with is that it was a leftover some meteorite that fell to Earth years ago. They cut it into the shape of a box and used it for religious purposes. During this time, the tribal people from all over the Mecca, Arabian Peninsula would come to Mecca once a year, and they would do their religious ceremonies. They would pray to their 360 gods. They would make circles around the Kaaba, done at a certain time every year. This made Mecca the center of religious and economic life, which happens to be the city that Muhammad grew up in. So it became the most wealthy and prosperous part of the peninsula was Mecca, because that's where they came every year. And still to this day, Muslims go to Mecca. Every Muslim's supposed to go once in their life. They're supposed to participate in certain prayers. The 360 gods are no longer honored, just Allah, but they still make circles around the Kaaba, just like they did during the times of ignorance. They had something called the Hajj. That was the annual pilgrimage. They were expected to go once a year. Now Muslims are expected to go once in their lifetime. If you're a Muslim, you're expected at least once in your lifetime, if you're able to, go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and participate in this religious ritual that involves circling the Kaaba. So it's different now for Muslims than it was during the time of ignorance, but it is a practice that goes back to pre-Islamic times. So this is a culture, this was a culture in which Muhammad was born. This was a culture of which Islam was founded. It brings us to Muhammad, the founder of Islam. He was born around 570 AD. They don't know the exact year. His parents died when he was young, so he had to be raised by his uncle. He started having visions in 610 AD, so he was about 40 years old. And at first, the only message he got was recite. Just said, Muhammad, recite. And he's like, recite what? Recite. And it scared him at first. He's like, what's going on? This is not a good thing. I believe it was his wife that eventually convinced him, this means you're a prophet. This is a good thing. You need to embrace these visions. So at that point, Muhammad started preaching out against corruption in the city of Mecca. First, he wasn't preaching anything new. He wasn't bringing a new religion at first. He was just preaching a message of righteousness. Then in 613, a few years later, that began to change. He received a revelation that Allah was the only God. So then he began teaching on the oneness of God. He began teaching monotheism and on Judgment Day. So this was a lot different. Before, Allah was just one of the 360 gods. Now he believes that Allah is the only God, and that there is only one God. So this is certainly one thing that Christians and Muslims have in common, is that we believe there's only one God. That what we believe about that God ends up being a lot different, but this monotheism is something we have in common. But it was a new thing to the people of Mecca. They were not willing to embrace it too quickly. And the idea of Judgment Day, they were not really keen on that either. That was something that was kind of reserved for the Christians and Jews to believe in. So this was kind of a new concept. At this point, he introduced the Shahada, and that simply says there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. That's the core creed of Islam. If you want to be a Muslim, you simply have to say that and believe it. You're supposed to say it in Arabic. My Arabic's not that good. I can't say it in Arabic, but that's what you would say if you wanted to become a Muslim. That brings us to the 5 pillars of Islam. We'll get back to Muhammad in a minute. The Shahada, declaring that there's only one God, Muhammad's his prophet. The Salat, that's praying 5 times a day, just like they did during the times of ignorance. The Sawam, that's fasting and self-control during the day, during the month of Ramadan. Zakat, they're supposed to give 2.5% of their savings to the poor and needy. And the Hajj. The Hajj is a pilgrimage to Mecca that they're supposed to make once in their lifetime. Now, do most Muslims around the world make it? No. The ones in Saudi Arabia and some in Iraq and that part of the world, they probably make that pilgrimage. But there are a lot of Muslims, you got to remember, in like Iran and Indonesia and America, and most of them are poor. They're never going to make this journey. But if they can, they are expected to. So that brings us back to Muhammad. So he was there in Mecca, in the city that's the center of religious life in the peninsula. He gains a small following at first. Most people aren't too excited at what he's trying to say, as he's saying there's only one God, and he's saying idolatry is wrong. They don't like it because idolatry is how they make their money. They have their whole economy is based on idol worshippers coming to their city every year and spending money and making that where they go. So they were not at all interested in what he had to say. During that time, he did speak favorably towards the Christians and the Jews. One, because he kind of needed all the friends he could get. He was in a small minority. And two, I think he really thought he could convert the Christians and Jews at first into believing that he was a prophet. So he started getting more and more resistance for economic reasons and for religious reasons, that eventually he had to flee. His band, a small band of about 150 followers, had to flee the city. And brings me to my next map. It's called the Hijra. Now the Hijra is the journey when Mecca and his Muhammad and his followers went from Mecca up to Medina, about 280 miles. This is probably the most important event in the history of Islam, was when they made that journey. That's when they start their calendar. You know, the Jews start their calendar based on when they think the world was created. Christians start our calendar based on when Jesus was born. Muslims start their calendar based on when this journey took place, because it changed everything. It was a turning point in their religion. 622 AD, 150 followers. Once he got to Medina, things were different. His followers, they immediately built a mosque, and they started to gain a larger following. The people in Medina weren't so opposed to what he said because their whole economy was not based on idol worship. So they were a little bit more open-minded about what he said. I think there were a few more Jews and Christians in the area, so they weren't so unfamiliar with monotheism. They weren't so unfamiliar with Judgment Day. It wasn't quite so foreign to them. But also there were some disputes going on in the city, and they needed a mediator. And they asked Muhammad to come and be a mediator for these disputes, and he was able to do so in a way that impressed the citizens. So they made him their leader. It became a Muslim city very quickly. He became basically a theocrat. It was a theocracy. He controlled the politics, the military, and the religion of the city. He was no longer this leader of the small band of persecuted followers. Rather, he was the leader of a city. He was a major, powerful person. He became wealthy. He continued raiding caravans. He became stronger as he would make his money doing this. He would gain power and influence. He became a problem for the Meccans, because the Meccans are counting on these caravans coming into their city every year so they can make their money, and he's out there raiding more and more caravans, becoming more powerful, disrupting things for them. So eventually they went to war. The people of Mecca, Muhammad's hometown, with 1,000 troops marched up to the city of Medina on March 13, 624 AD. 1,000 Meccans versus 300 Muslims from Medina. The Muslims were victorious. It was a decisive battle. The Muslim took this as a sign from God. Allah is on our side. Allah helped us defeat these polytheistic, these pagans, these idol worshippers. We're the one true religion. Allah is on our side. The Battle of Badr is still an inspiration to Muslims today. In Iraq, there's a militia called the Badr Brigade. They just take their inspiration from this battle. It established Islam as a new force to be reckoned with. Muslims were no longer considered an insignificant, persecuted minority. They were a new military force. So these cities continued to do battle over the time to come, and eventually they signed a 10-year peace treaty between Muhammad and the city of Mecca. And according to this peace treaty, the Meccans were supposed to clear out of their city once a year so that the Muslims could come down and participate in the religious worship. At some point along the line, something happened. Apparently, some Muslims were killed while they were down there worshiping, but that was enough for Muhammad to break the treaty. He said, the treaty's off, we're back at war. So this time, he's probably looking for an excuse to break the treaty, if anything. At this time, he takes 10,000 troops down. He's a major military leader now, and he laid siege to his home city, his hometown of Mecca. The city surrenders and converts to Islam. So he becomes the dictator of that city. He goes to the Kaaba. He finds the 360 idols. He smashes them all. He says, idol worship is no longer acceptable in this city. The worship of any god but Allah is no longer acceptable in this city. It's now a Muslim city. And from there, he started conquering the surrounding tribal people and introducing them to Islam as well. He died unexpectedly in 632 AD. One theory I found on the internet of how he died was that he was poisoned by a Jewish wife. He brought in a woman who was already married and had her husband killed, and the woman in turn poisoned him. I don't know if that's really how he died or not, but the point is that he died unexpectedly. He did not have time to tell anybody who was going to be in charge once he died. So there's been some controversy as to who was supposed to lead this growing empire. But there was some general agreement that there were 4 men, we're going to talk about each of them, called caliphs, that followed him after he died. A caliph is basically a deputy. It's the person who reigns in place of Muhammad. A caliphate, if you ever hear that word, you might hear it in the news today. That's the political unity of the entire Muslim community. So if all the Muslims in the world have one leader that they all agree on, that's a caliph. His government is called the caliphate. So let's look at each of these caliphs very briefly. Abu Bakr reigned for only 2 years. He was Muhammad's father-in-law and an early convert. He expanded Islam throughout Arabia. So remember, Muhammad conquered one city in the area around it. Now Muhammad spreads it out through the entire Arabian Peninsula. He said to start assembling the Quran. The Quran was a bunch of messages that Allah had given to Muhammad that were written down. He starts assembling them all into one book. And he was recognized by the Sunnis. We're going to talk about a little bit about the Sunnis and the Shiites. The Sunnis recognized him as the first caliph. The Shiites did not. They considered him to be the usurper. He did name a replacement before he died in 634. His replacement was Umar. Umar canonized the Quran. He said exactly, this is what belongs in the Quran, this does not. And he established the science of the Hadith. The Hadith we're going to talk about more next week. The Hadith is basically some traditions, some sayings that Muhammad said that didn't actually make it into the Quran, but are considered a secondary source of inspiration. He established that science. He oversaw the conquest of Mesopotamia, that's basically Iraq, Egypt, and Jerusalem. So the kingdom's growing under each of these caliphs. He was assassinated by a fellow Muslim in 644. He too was considered to be a usurper by the Shiite. Third caliph was Uthman. He was Muhammad's son-in-law. He produced the first official version of the Quran. This was his main accomplishment. There was some controversy about what verses belonged in the Quran and what versions didn't. He made an official version. He said this is the only version of the Quran that's acceptable. He had several copies of it made, sent throughout the empire, and ordered all of the copies to be destroyed. So he put an end to that debate. So you can't take a modern Quran like you can take a modern Bible and compare it to early manuscripts. There are no early manuscripts. He funneled them all into the one he was comfortable with, and that was it. That was Uthman's big accomplishment. He also oversaw the conquest of Iran, North Africa, and Cyprus. So the kingdom's growing at this time. He was controversial because he appointed many of his relatives as governors, which eventually took the name sultans. A lot of tensions arose between his family and Abu Bakr's family, the first caliph. He too is considered by Shiites to be a usurper. And he too was assassinated by fellow Muslims who considered him to be corrupt. So that brings us to Ali. Ali is the one that the Sunnis and Shiites agree on. The Sunnis would say that there are 4 caliphs, 1, 2, 3, then Ali. The Shiites would say that it was Ali all along. He was the only leader that took Muhammad's place, and the other 3 were not legit. So it's not real important that you understand all the differences between Sunnis and Shiites, although it's an interesting study. He was controversial too because he was accused of being complicit in the death of Uthman, the previous caliph. He dismissed some of the governors that he had, the previous one had instituted. A civil war broke out during his reign. Muhawa of Syria challenged his authority and attacked him. So there's a big civil war. While the kingdom was growing outwardly, it was fighting amongst itself inwardly. He too was assassinated by fellow Muslims who wanted to end this feud system. So with the death of Ali marked the end of the caliphate. There was no longer any sense of unity amongst Muslims after that time. So it brings us to the Sunni-Shiite split. Again, just real briefly, the Shiites are followers of Ali. That's what Shiite means. The Shiites believe, hey, if we're going to have a caliph, he's going to have to be a descendant of the family of Muhammad. He has to be from that bloodline. Whereas the Sunnis believe, hey, if we're going to have a caliph, we all kind of need to get our leaders together and kind of vote on somebody who's going to be a caliph. That's the main difference. Sunnis are the majority in the world in most Islamic places, except Iran and southern Iraq. That is predominantly Shiite. And there are also some pockets in Syria, some pockets in Saudi Arabia, but mostly Iran and southern Iraq is Shiite. Everywhere else is Sunni. So this Islamic conquest that we're talking about, remember, Muhammad died in 632. So let's just look at some of these places. I don't know if you can see them up there. I'll just read them off. Syria was conquered in 637. Armenia in 639. Egypt in 639. North Africa in 652. Cyprus in 654. Constantinople, which was the eastern hub of Christianity, was the eastern capital of the Roman Empire. It had been attacked twice by the Muslims in the 600s and in the 700s. They conquered Spain in the early 700s. They conquered Georgia, not the state, but the country, in 736. They conquered Crete in 827. Southern Italy in 827. They actually made the Pope pay taxes. They were halted by a guy named Charles Martel in France on 10/10 of 732. If you don't know the name Charles Martel, you should. He was a military leader who was able to stop the Muslim advance from completely marching across Europe. So sometimes the French get a bad name from a military perspective, but that's not always fair. Charles Martel was a great military leader. So let's look at this on a map. I don't know if you can see my map. Can you guys see that kind of, sort of? Okay, this dark green part, this is the part that was conquered during the life of Muhammad. This light green part, this was the time that was conquered during the four righteously guided caliphs. And this yellow part here and here was the part that was conquered up to 750. So you can see Islam was a rapidly expanding empire. They were very aggressive. They were good at military tactics, and they grew very quickly. So that brings us up to the lead up to the Crusades. The Crusades, of course, are a very controversial topic. You always hear about the Crusades. Are the Crusades good or bad when you hear about them? The Crusades are bad. I mean, everybody talks about the Crusades. How can you be a Christian, some people will say, when you know that those evil Christian crusaders, they took their swords and they went out and conquered all these innocent people. And while there's some truth to that, you got to understand the historical context in which the Crusades happened. Remember, the Muslims were making incursions into Europe from all sides. They were coming up through Constantinople, through the east, through Spain, through the west, through Italy from the south. Europe was in danger of being overrun by the Muslims long before the Crusades happened. Attacks on Catholic pilgrims to the Holy Land. The Catholic priests were sending people down to the Holy Land to do penance, and they were getting attacked by Muslims. They were also starting to hear stories of persecution and enslavement in these lands that had been conquered by the Muslims. That didn't always happen. Some places they had different degrees of freedom, but oftentimes Muslims conquered an area, they sold you into slavery, the Christians and the Jews. Sometimes they burned the churches and the synagogues. So these stories were circulating throughout Europe. Multiple attacks had been done on Constantinople, the eastern hub of Christianity. So finally, the Byzantine emperor sent a letter to the Pope saying, we need help. Send us help. Send some help to your fellow Christians. Send us some soldiers. We're about to be overrun. And that was the beginning of the Crusades. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II gave a powerful sermon urging his Catholic followers to join this military force, to be part of the Crusades, and go help their Eastern Orthodox Christians over in Constantinople. Now, in the process, he made some